The young Duke of Renholt took the ring from his mother's hand in front of 300 people, and he did it gently, which was somehow worse. He had to work it over the knuckle. The Wren signet had sat on her right hand for 11 years, since the morning they lowered her husband into the family vault, and the gold had worn itself a small, smooth bed in her skin. Julian held her wrist as if she were an old woman who might fall, and he turned the ring and he drew it off, and the whole gilded ballroom watched him do it under 1,000 candles. "It is for your own sake, mother," he said, loud enough to carry. "You are not well. You have not been well for some time." The Dowager Duchess of Renholt did not pull her hand back. She did not weep. She looked at her son's handsome, frightened face. Frightened, though he wore certainty over it like a borogoat. And she said nothing at all, and that silence rolled out across the room like cold water. A footman by the door had read the document aloud a moment before, because Julian had handed it to him and told him to. A physician's certificate, the hand of one Dr. Silas Marsh, attesting that the Duchess Adelaide was of unsound mind, prone to delusion and wandering, unfit to manage her affairs or the guardianship of the late Duke's young daughter, and best removed for her own comfort to the house at Fenwick in the north. There was a wax seal on it, the colour of dried blood. 300 guests in their jewel silks held their breath and enjoyed it. This was better than the supper would be, and Adelaide Vane stood in the centre of the floor in her black morning gown, shot with the faintest plum, her chin level, her grey eyes moving once around the room, across the bride glittering on Julian's other arm, across the grey physician smiling his soft physician's smile, across the bishop, the bankers, the magistrate her son had been so very careful to invite, and she let them all see that she was not going to cry. Watch her hands. Everyone watched her hands, waiting for them to shake. They did not shake. The certificate trembled, but it trembled in his grip in Julian's as he folded it away. No tears, no protest, no apology dragged out of her. And not one of the 300 people in that room understood that the woman they had come to watch be broken was the only person present who knew exactly how the night would end. If a story about a woman they tried to bury alive, and the patience it takes to climb back out, earns your respect, before it's over, take 1 second now and subscribe. Because what she does with the next 6 months is the whole reason I wanted to tell you this. Let me take you back to before the ring. Renholt House had been cold since the old Duke died. Not in temperature, there were fires enough. The man's fortune saw to that, but in the way a house goes cold when the heart of it stops. Edmund Vane, 9th Duke of Renholt, had been a difficult, clever, deeply private man who loved exactly 3 things: his estate, his daughter Beatrice, and his wife. He had married Adelaide late and against advice, and he had never once regretted it. And on his deathbed 11 years gone, he had held her wrist the same way their son now held it, but for the opposite reason. "You'll hold it all, Addie," he had said, his voice down to a thread. "Not the boy, you. Crane has the papers. When the time comes that someone tries to take this house, you let them think they've won, and then you show them what I left in your hands. Promise me you'll wait. Promise me you won't strike first." She had promised. She had not, in 11 years, had cause to keep it. The old Duke had known his son. Julian was golden and warm and weak, in the particular way of men who have never been told no. Generous when it cost him nothing, cruel when he was afraid, and steerable, endlessly steerable, by anyone who flattered the right wound. Edmund had loved the boy, and had not trusted him with so much as the key to the wine cellar, and he had built the whole architecture of the Renholt estate around that single clear-eyed grief. He had made his wife the sole trustee of the entail. Every acre, every farm, every brick of the great house, the London accounts, the colliery shares, all of it held in a trust that Adelaide controlled until her death, with Julian merely the heir who would inherit after her, and only if she chose to confirm it. On paper, before the world, Julian was the Duke, and his mother was the dowager who lived on his charity. In law, sealed in a strongbox in the office of Nathaniel Crane, the entire fortune answered to her and to no one else. Edmund had told no one but Crane and Adelaide, not even Julian. Especially not Julian. Let him grow into it, he'd said, or let him show you he can't. And then he had died, and Adelaide had buried him, and put on his signet, and waited. She had been waiting when Cordelia Marsh arrived. The girl had come to Wrenholt the previous spring in the train of a county family, beautiful and laughing, and very, very attentive to the young Duke, with copper gold ringlets and wide hazel eyes that filled with tears at all the moments tears were useful. She had a little gold crucifix she wore when the bishop dined and took off when he didn't, and she had an uncle, Dr. Silas Marsh, a physician of soft voice and grey coat, who appeared at Wrenholt not long after his niece and made himself indispensable. A tonic for the Duke's headaches, a draught for his sleep, a sympathetic ear for every doubt the young man had ever swallowed. Adelaide had watched the uncle smell his own preparations before he gave them, the way a man checks a thing he has reason to think about, and she had felt the floor of her certainty shift. Because she knew that smell, bitter almonds, faint under the camphor. It had hung in Edmund's sick room in the last weeks. She had thought it the medicines then, the dozen well-meaning physicians and their dozen bottles. Edmund had not been a young man. His heart had failed. Everyone had said so. But she remembered the smell, and now it walked the corridors of Wrenholt again in a leather case, and it stood at her son's elbow and poured him a draught for his sleep. She had not screamed it across the dinner table. She had not run to Julian, who would have laughed and told Cordelia, who would have told the uncle. She had done what Edmund taught her. She had begun quietly to write things down. That was the journal. The small leather journal that everyone at Wrenholt by autumn had decided was proof the old Duchess had gone soft in the head, for she wrote in it constantly, at odd hours, and once Cordelia had glimpsed a page over her shoulder, dates and times and lists of who took what tonic when, and Cordelia had gone very still, and then had gone to her uncle, and the two of them had gone to Julian with a soft and sorrowful suggestion. His poor mother. Had he not noticed the muttering, the endless scribbling, the way she stared at Dr. Marsh as if he were a ghost, the wandering of her wits since the late Duke's passing? Grief did such things to a woman of her age. It would be a kindness, truly, the kindest thing, to have her looked after. Dr. Marsh would write the certificate himself. He could not in conscience do otherwise. And Julian, who was afraid of his dead father, afraid of his clever silent mother, afraid most of all of the suspicion that he was not equal to the name he carried. Julian had let himself be steered. It was easier to believe his mother was mad than to believe he was being managed. So he had agreed that the announcement should be made at the betrothal gala, before everyone, so that no one could later say it had been done in a corner. He thought that made it honest. He did not know about the trust. No one had told him. His father had seen to that. So now you understand the ring, and the certificate, and the 300 candles, and the woman standing in the center of it all who would not cry. After Julian took the signet, the orchestra struck up because someone signaled them to, and the room turned its 100 conversations back on, relieved, and the dowager was left to walk off the floor alone. No one took her arm. The bishop looked at his shoes. The magistrate, a square, honest man named Hartley, who had been the old Duke's friend, looked at her with something that was not contempt. But he had read the certificate, and a certificate is a certificate, and he held his peace. It was a footman who moved, a boy of perhaps 17, new to the house, who saw the Duchess crossing that vast cold floor with nowhere to go, and who stepped from his post by the wall and offered her his arm before he could think better of it. His hand was shaking. He expected to be dismissed for it. "Thank you," Adelaide said quietly, and took his arm, and let him walk her to the door as if he were a duke himself, and at the door she said, low, "What is your name?" "Tom, your Grace." "You won't lose your place, Tom. You have my word." A pause, such as it is tonight, and the ghost of something crossed her face that was very nearly humour, and the boy never forgot it. And that is the kind of thing she did when no one important was watching, which is how you know what she was, underneath the silence. In the cold corridor outside, her maid was waiting. Tess Pruitt had been with Adelaide for 15 years, and she had a tongue on her like a carving knife and the loyalty of a guard dog. She fell into step, took one look at her mistress's bare right hand, and said, "Took the ring, did he?" In front of the whole braying lot of them. And here's me thinking the boy hadn't the spine to do worse than spill his wine. "He had help finding it," Adelaide said. "The copper-haired baggage and her almond-stinking uncle." Tess sniffed. "I'd not let that man physic a dog of mine. You've seen how he sniffs his own bottles. A man sniffs his own bottles. He knows what's in them, and he's afraid of it." Adelaide stopped walking. She looked at her maid, sharp, ordinary, fearless Tess, and she made a decision she had been circling for weeks. "Tess, I am going to ask you to do something, and I need you to do it without telling a soul, even me, in any room with a keyhole. Go on, Doctor." "Marsh keeps tonics in cobalt blue bottles. When one is empty, it is thrown out, into the kitchen fire or the midden. The next empty one that comes down, I want it. Don't wash it. Cork it and hide it, and tell me nothing where we can be heard." She held Tess's eyes. "Can you do that without anyone wondering at it?" Tess, who emptied the slosspops and laid the fires, and was as invisible to the family as the wallpaper, smiled a slow, grim smile. "Your Grace," she said, "there's not a thing comes out of that man's room I can't get my hands on before it hits the ash. They forget I've ears. They forget I've a nose, too." She paused. "What is it then? What's in the blue bottles?" "I don't know yet," Adelaide said. "That's why I want one." That was the first thread. Here is how she pulled the rest. The weeks after the gala were an education in how a great house turns on a woman it has decided is finished. The servants who had curtsied to her began to do it more shallowly, then to forget. Cordelia, not yet married but already mistress of the place in all but name, ordered the dowager's apartments inventoried. Every painting, every book, every jewel listed in a clerk's hand for safekeeping during her Grace's absence. Adelaide stood in her own sitting room while a stranger counted her dead husband's letters into a box, and she said nothing, and she watched which letters the clerk set aside at Cordelia's whispered instruction. The ones in Edmund's hand, the ones about the estate. They did not know what they were hunting for. They only knew the old Duke had been a careful man, and careful men leave traps. They were right to be afraid. They were simply looking in the wrong room. She tested the thing herself, once, in a way no one saw, because she had to be certain before she gambled her son's life on a suspicion. One evening she contrived to be in Julian's apartments before the night tray came up. She still had the freedom of the house in those weeks, for a mad old woman is harmless and may wander, and she busied herself at his shelves as if hunting a book, and when Cordelia carried in the cobalt bottle and set it by the bed and went out again, Adelaide drew the cork and touched one drop to the back of her own hand and to her tongue. Bitter, faintly sweet, the almond ghost of it blooming at the back of her throat, and then, within a quarter hour, sitting very still in her own room, with her fingers on her own wrist, a slow thick heaviness in the chest, a heart that laboured and skipped, a grey edge creeping in at the sides of her vision. One drop, and she a healthy woman of full habit. She thought of Julian drinking a full measure of it every night since the spring, growing paler, growing breathless, and calling it nothing, and she sat with her hand on her own slowing pulse, and did not let herself weep, because weeping wakes a house, and she needed the house asleep. By morning the heaviness had us off and left her shaken and sure. She wrote the date in the journal, and the dose and the effect upon herself, in a hand that did not tremble and underlined nothing, because evidence that shouts is evidence men distrust. Worst of all was Beatrice. The girl was 16, the late Duke's daughter, dark and quick and grieving, and she had loved Adelaide as the only mother she had ever really known. For her own had died bearing her, and Adelaide had raised her, and Cordelia, who understood that a grieving child is the easiest creature alive to turn, had set about it patiently. A word here. Your stepmother frightens me, Bea, the way she stares. A kindness there. Don't tell her I gave you the ribbons, she'd only be cross. She's not herself, poor thing. And slowly, the way a stream cuts stone, Beatrice had been carried away from the one person at Wrenholt who would have died for her. It was Beatrice who hurt. Adelaide could stand the bare finger and the shallow curtsies and the clerk in her sitting room. But she came down one morning and heard, through a half-open door, her own ward's voice saying to Cordelia, I don't think she should be allowed near me. Julian says she's dangerous. And she had to put her hand flat against the cold panelling and stand there a moment until her breath came back. She did not go in and plead her case. A woman accused of madness cannot argue herself sane. The more she protests, the madder she seems, and Cordelia had built the cage cleverly enough that every bar of it was Adelaide's own love turned inside out. So she did the one thing that was still hers to do. That night she went up to the girl's room while Beatrice slept, and she did not wake her, and she left on the pillow beside her a small thing, a pressed flower from the late Duke's grave, a winter aconite, the first thing that flowered there each year, which she and Beatrice had gone together to gather every spring since Edmund died. No note. A note could be shown to Cordelia and called a mad woman's raving. Only the flower that the girl would know, that said in the one language Cordelia could not intercept. Whatever they tell you I am, I was your mother on the cold mornings, and I have not stopped. Beatrice said nothing of it in the morning, but Adelaide saw, days later, that the aconite had been pressed flat inside the girl's prayer book and kept. And she let herself believe, on the strength of one dried flower, that not all of the stream had been cut away, and that when the hour came there, might be a daughter left to come back to her. It was a thin hope to carry through a winter. She carried it anyway. That was her moment of doubt. Every woman of steel is allowed one, and this was hers. Standing in the corridor with her hand on the wall, 51 years old, stripped of her ring and her name, and now the love of the child she'd raised, she thought, with terrible clarity. I could simply let them win. Go to Fenwick, be the mad old woman, it would be quiet there. And then she thought of Edmund's voice. Promise me you'll wait. And of the smell of bitter almonds in a sick room. And of the fact that a man who has poisoned one Duke of Wrenholt has no reason on earth to stop at the second, her son, golden weak Julian, who drank a sleeping draught from that leather case every single night. She took her hand off the wall. She went down to write in her journal. The doubt was real, and it was finished, and her steel meant more for having bent once and held. Now, the proof, because the rebrand of this house's fortunes was never going to be a speech. Edmund had taught her that too. Spectacle, not a sermon. She needed 3 things, and over those weeks she gathered them, with the patience of a woman threading a needle in poor light. The first was already coming, the blue bottle. Within a fortnight, Tess slipped into her room at dawn, knelt at the hearth as if to lay the fire, and pressed into Adelaide's hand a small cobalt bottle, corked, a sticky brown residue dried in its base. "Off the tray that goes up to the young Duke," Tess breathed, lips barely moving. "Marsh fills it. The bride carries it up herself of a night. I took the empty before it hit the fire and put a clean one in its place. No one the wiser." She sat back on her heels and said, in her ordinary scrubbing the grate voice, loud, "There, Your Grace, that's the chill off it, for the benefit of the corridor," and went on laying the fire. Adelaide held the bottle to her face. Bitter almonds, faint under camphor, the smell of the sick room, the smell of her husband dying. She did not yet have what that smell could be proved to be, but she knew a man who would. The second thing was the certificate itself. Adelaide had never been examined by Dr. Silas Marsh, not once, not for a moment. The certificate claimed he had attended her over a course of weeks. That was a lie she could prove if she could lay her hands on his movements. And physicians, like all men who bill for their time, keep ledgers. The third thing, the foundation under all of it, was the sealed trust, lying where it had lain for 11 years, in the office of Nathaniel Crane. Which brings us, at last, to the plain man in the ink-stained cuffs. Nathaniel Crane had been the old Duke's man of business for 20 years and had no intention of becoming the new one's. He was 44, a widower, dry as a ledger and twice as exact. And when the rumours reached him in town that the Dowager Duchess had been declared mad and was to be packed off to Fenwick, he did a thing that surprised everyone who knew him. He closed his office, called for his horse, and rode to Wrenholt, unannounced in the rain. He arrived mud to the knee, and was very nearly turned away at the door by a footman acting on Cordelia's standing order that the Dowager was to receive no visitors. Crane simply removed his spectacles, polished them, replaced them, and said, "Inform Her Grace that her late husband's solicitor is here on a matter of the estate, and that if I am turned from this door, I will return tomorrow with the magistrate beside me." Mr. Hartley and I dined together on Thursday. The footman, weighing the two terrors, chose the absent Cordelia's wrath over the present solicitors and let him in. They met in the small north sitting room, the cold one, with Tess at the door pretending to mend a curtain. Crane bowed to her exactly as deeply as he had always bowed to her, not a hair less. He did not look at her as if she were cracked. He looked at her as if she were the Duchess of Wrenholt, and he had a great deal of business to get through. "Your Grace," he said, "I'll come to it plainly, because I think plainness is what you've been starved of in this house. I do not believe you are mad. I have known you 11 years, and I have never met a saner head, your husband's not excepted. I believe you have been made the target of a fraud, and I believe I am holding the weapon that ends it, and I have ridden through filthy weather to ask whether you are ready to use it." For the first time in many weeks, something in Adelaide's chest loosened. To be believed, to be looked at and seen when the whole world had agreed to look away. She had not known how much she needed it until it was in front of her, dry and plain and sopping wet to the knee. "Mr. Crane," she said, "sit down before you drip on my husband's rug. We have a great deal to do." They were not a romance, those two, not yet, and neither of them would have used the word. He came back twice more that month, each time with a thicker satchel and a drier wit, and each time he stayed an hour longer than the business strictly required. And each time Tess, watching from the curtain, drew her own conclusions and kept them for once to herself. He brought her the law, and she brought him the smell of bitter almonds, and between them, slowly, the trap the old Duke had built began to come back to life. Here is what they assembled, brick by brick, in those weeks before the wedding. Crane held the trust deed, the true one, sealed, witnessed, registered quietly with the Court of Chancery the year before Edmund died. naming Adelaide sole trustee of the entire Renholt entail. Julian's claim to the estate, his right to retire, his mother, and seize her guardianship of Beatrice, his very authority to throw the gala and take her ring, all of it rested on the assumption that he owned what he stood on. He owned none of it. He never had. Crane also held something Adelaide had not expected. In going through the late Duke's private papers, the solicitor had found a second sealed packet, marked in Edmund's hand, "To be opened only if my son's birthright is challenged, or if he challenges his mother's." Crane had not opened it. "It is not mine to open," he said, "but I'd have you know it exists. Your husband left it for a moment like this one." Adelaide looked at the packet a long time. She thought she knew what was in it. She had her own reasons for thinking so. Old reasons. 11 years buried, the kind a wife keeps even from herself. She did not open it either. Next, the certificate. Through a clerk Crane knew in the city, they obtained, for a consideration, a copy of the relevant pages of Dr. Silas Marsh's appointment ledger. The dates on which Marsh swore he had examined the Duchess at Renholt were dates on which his own book placed him in Bath, 90 miles south, attending a wealthy widow whose family, Crane noted with a thin smile, had buried her 3 weeks later and were now contesting a sudden change to her will. A pattern, if anyone cared to look. Adelaide filed that away. The certificate was a forgery built on a lie of presence. That alone would shatter it in any honest room. And last, the bottle. Crane took the cobalt bottle, sealed in a twist of paper, to a man he trusted absolutely, an apothecary and amateur chemist in the city, an old, exact, incorruptible man, and asked him to say what residue clung to its base. The answer came back in a careful hand. The brown residue, distilled and tested, yielded the unmistakable signature of an extract of cherry laurel. Laurel water, a clear liquid smelling of bitter almonds, used in tiny doses to calm the stomach and the nerves, and in patient accumulating doses, to stop a heart so gradually that any physician would write, "Failure of the heart," and mean it. The apothecary added a line of his own. "In my 40 years I have known this use to murder twice, and both times it was put into a sleeping draught, for the dose is masked by the night." A sleeping draught. The very thing Cordelia carried up to Julian's room every single night in a cobalt blue bottle. Adelaide read that line 3 times, then she understood the whole shape of it, and her blood went cold, and then very, very steady. They were not merely robbing her. The Marshes had killed the father and were killing the son, slowly, a draught at a time, so that when the young Duke's heart failed within a year or 2 of his marriage, his grieving widow Cordelia would inherit everything as Duchess of Renholt, with her uncle, the physician, at her side to write the certificate of natural death. And the only obstacle to that tidy double murder, the only person who had seen the pattern and written it down, was an inconvenient old woman who had to be discredited and removed. First, before the second Duke could be allowed to die, because a sane dowager would ask questions a mad one couldn't. That was why the gala. That was why the ring. They needed her declared mad and gone to Fenwick before they finished Julian, so that no one would believe her if she cried murder from the wrong end of the country. She had thought she was fighting for her dignity. She had been fighting for her son's life, and she had not even known it. "How long," she asked Crane, her voice very level, "does the apothecary say a man could take that dose before his heart gave out?" "He estimates the young Duke has been taking it since the spring." Crane removed his spectacles. "He says a year, perhaps less. He says the wedding would be a natural milestone at which to increase the dose. The wedding was in 11 days, so now you see why she could not simply expose the forgery, win back her ring, and retire in triumph. If she struck too soon, denounced Marsh as a forger, won the trust battle in some quiet chamber's hearing. The marshes would scatter, the poison would go uncaught, and her weak, blind, beloved son would still die within the year of a heart that no one had reason to question, with Cordelia weeping prettily at the graveside. She had to take all of it at once. The fraud, the forgery, the bigamy she had not yet even uncovered, and the poison, all in one room, before witnesses who could not be bought. At a moment from which there was no retreat, she had to let them get her son to the very altar. And then she had to detonate the whole thing on the wedding day itself. She told Crane her plan in the cold north room, and the dry solicitor listened to it all the way through, and at the end he was quiet a long moment, and then he said, "Your Grace, in 20 years I served a man I thought was the cleverest I would ever meet. I see now where he found his match." And he did not polish his spectacles when he said it. He just looked at her, and something passed between them that neither named, and both knew. There was one piece still missing, and it found her rather than the other way round. Tess, who had ears the family forgot about, came to her 4 days before the wedding white about the mouth. She had been in the linen passage behind the morning room when Cordelia took a visitor she'd not wanted announced, a heavy red-faced man in a travelling coat who had spoken low and fast and angry, and whom Cordelia had paid, from her own hand, to go away again. Tess had caught only fragments through the door, but the fragments were these: "My wife, never any annulment. I'll have what's owed before you've a new husband to hide behind. You were Mrs. Ask before you were ever a fine lady, and the law knows it." "She's married already," Tess hissed. "That man's her husband. The copper-haired baggage is wed, and the knot's never been cut, and she stood there in church planning to do it again to your Julian, with a bishop watching. Bigamy. The marriage to Julian, if it went forward, would not be a marriage at all. It would be a crime, and a void one, which meant that even if Julian died on schedule, Cordelia Marsh would inherit nothing, because she would never have been his lawful wife. Unless, of course, the first husband was paid to vanish, or made to. Adelaide thought of the red-faced man being paid to go away, and of Dr. Marsh and his patient blue bottles, and she suspected the first husband had a shorter life ahead of him than he knew. She had Crane find the man. His name was Hask, a corn factor from Bristol, coarse and grasping, but, crucially, alive and aggrieved and entirely willing to swear in any court in England that Cordelia was his lawful wife, for he wanted the scandal as a lever to squeeze her, and a public hearing suited his greed perfectly. Crane installed him quietly at an inn near Renholt, kept sober and watched, and promised him his day. Now she had everything: the trust, the forged certificate and the ledger that broke it, the poisoned bottle and the apothecary's sworn analysis, the living first husband, and the sealed packet in Edmund's hand that she still had not opened, and would not until she had to. 4 threads braided into one rope, and a room already chosen for the hanging. For the Marshes themselves had chosen it. The wedding was to be at Renholt, in the great gilded ballroom, before 300 witnesses, with the bishop to marry them, and the magistrate Hartley as a guest of honour, and, by long custom, the signing of the marriage settlement to take place immediately after the vows, with bankers and lawyers present to witness the transfer of property. Every person Adelaide needed in one room. The villains had built her stage for her, thinking it was theirs. She let them. The wedding morning came grey and bright. Frost on the long windows, the ballroom dressed in white roses and 10,000 candles. Cordelia was radiant in ivory and rose gold and seed pearls, the little gold crucifix at her throat for the bishop. Julian was golden and nervous, and already Adelaide saw with a clench of her heart, paler than a bridegroom should be, with a grey tinge about the lips, that no one but a watching mother and a poisoner would notice. He had taken his draught the night before. He would take it that night. If she failed today, she did not think he had many more. She was not, of course, invited. A mad dowager bound for Fenwick does not attend her son's wedding. She was meant to be upstairs, packed, the carriage for the north waiting in the yard. Cordelia had seen to that with poisonous courtesy. A maid posted at the dowager's door. The trunks corded, the journey arranged for the moment the vows were done, so that the inconvenient old woman would be gone before the settlement was signed. But the maid at the door was Tess, and the trunks, when you opened them, did not hold the dowager's mourning at all. They held, packed in straw, a strong box of documents, and at the bottom of the largest, folded with terrible care, a gown. Not black. Adelaide had worn black for 11 years, for a husband she had loved, and she would put it on again tomorrow and the day after. But not today. Today she had Tess lace her into deep burgundy silk, jewel dark, blood rich, the colour of a verdict, high at the throat with jet beading, and she sat at the glass while Tess pinned her silver-threaded hair, smooth beneath the jet and diamond circlet, and she did not look mad, and she did not look defeated, and she did not look 51. She looked like the trustee of the entire Wrenholt estate dressing to go to work. "They'll have started the vows," Tess said, fixing the last pin. "Let them finish the vows." Adelaide stood and settled the burgundy. "I want them married in the eyes of every soul in that room before I tell those souls what the marriage is. I want the bishop to have just said the words. I want Cordelia to have had her one perfect moment of being the Duchess of Wrenholt." She drew on her gloves. "And then I want to take it from her in front of all of them, the way it was taken from me. Spectacle, my husband used to say, not a sermon." Downstairs, Crane was already in the ballroom in his sober coat, satchel at his side, looking like nothing at all, which was his great gift. The magistrate, Hartley, was in the second row. The bankers and the settlement lawyers sat ready at a long table, to one side with the marriage articles, laid out, pens uncapped. Near the doors, unremarked, 3 men waited whom Crane had let quietly in. An officer of the law in plain dress, the apothecary down from the city with his sealed report, and a heavy red-faced corn factor from Bristol, named Husk, in a borrowed coat, sweating and impatient, and watched on both sides. At the front, beneath the painted ceiling, the bishop closed his book. Julian Vane and Cordelia Marsh were married. The room rose into applause. Cordelia turned, luminous, triumphant, the new Duchess of Wrenholt, and her wide hazel eyes swept the adoring crowd, and stopped on the far doors, which had opened. The Dowager Duchess of Wrenholt walked into her son's wedding in blood-red silk, alone upright, her bare right hand swinging at her side, and she came up the centre of the room at an unhurried pace while 300 people forgot to keep applauding. Julian's face curdled. "Mother, you are not. You are meant to be." He looked wildly for the Vade who should have kept her upstairs, for Cordelia, for the uncle. "She is unwell. Someone. She is not in her right mind, please, this is. Then it can do no harm to let a madwoman speak," Adelaide said, and her low voice carried to the painted ceiling, because she had learned long ago that you do not need to shout in a room that has gone silent. After all, who would believe me? She stopped 10 feet from the bridal pair. She let the room hold its breath, and then she did not rave, and did not weep, and did not accuse. She turned to the long table of settlement lawyers and said, in the dry tone of a woman conducting ordinary business, "Gentlemen, before you witness any transfer of Wrenholt property under these articles, you will want to confirm that the party signing them owns the property he proposes to settle. I am told he believes he does." She inclined her head toward her son. "Mr. Crane, and plain, unremarkable Nathaniel Crane rose from his unremarkable chair, opened his satchel, and laid upon the lawyer's table a single sealed and witnessed document, registered with the Court of Chancery, dated the year before the late Duke's death. The senior settlement lawyer read it. His face changed. He read it again. He passed it without a word to the man beside him. It went down the table hand to hand, and the silence got deeper with every pair of eyes. "Read it aloud," Adelaide said gently. "My son had a footman read a document aloud about me before this very company some weeks ago." Turn and turn about. The lawyer's voice shook a little as he read it. The trust, entire and unbreakable, naming Adelaide Vane sole trustee of the Wrenholt entail for the term of her natural life, with the heir to take only at her death and only upon her confirmation. Julian owned nothing, had owned nothing. The gala, the ring, the certificate, the order packing his mother off to Fenwick. Every act of authority he had performed for 6 months had been performed over property that was hers. The blood went out of Julian's face. He turned to Cordelia, and then to the grey physician at the edge of the dais, and his expression was that of a man feeling the floor tilt, who does not yet understand that someone has been sawing the joists for a year. "That is a forgery," Cordelia said. Her voice was bright and certain, and she put her hand on Julian's arm. "My love, your mother is ill. You know she is ill. Dr. Marsh has it under his own hand. She would say anything, sign anything. This is exactly the delusion he warned us of." "Ah," said Adelaide. "The certificate, yes. Let us speak of Dr. Marsh's hand." She did not even raise her voice. "Dr. Marsh, you swore under your seal that you examined me at Wrenholt on 4 occasions across the autumn and found me of unsound mind. Will you confirm to this company that you did so?" The physician was too clever to walk into an open door. He spread his soft hands. "I would not distress your grace by—" "Mr. Crane," Adelaide said, "the ledger." Crane laid the second document on the table beside the first. "These are copies, certified, of the appointment ledger of Dr. Silas Marsh," he said in his dry court voice. "On every one of the 4 dates upon which the certificate swears he attended the Duchess here at Wrenholt, his own book places him in the city of Bath, 90 miles distant, in daily attendance upon a Mrs. Ardent, a widow who altered her will to his niece's advantage and died 3 weeks later. He let that sit. He never examined her grace, not once. The certificate is a forgery, sworn to a course of visits that never occurred, and I will produce the man who copied it, and the Bath apothecary who served him there, both presently in London and at the magistrate's disposal." Magistrate Hartley was already on his feet. Cordelia's hand tightened on Julian's arm. "This is madness. This is exactly Julian. Say something." "I am not finished," said Adelaide, "and I am being very calm, which I notice is more than can be said for the bride." A few people, against all instinct, laughed. The nervous laugh of a room that has felt the wind change. "We have established that my son owns nothing, and that the physician's certificate is a forgery built on a lie of presence. Now I am afraid we must establish what the bride is, Mr. Hask." The heavy red-faced man came forward from the doors, twisting his hat, sweating but loud, gloriously, ruinously loud. "She's my wife," he said, jabbing a thick finger at Cordelia. "Cordelia Hask married me at St. Jude's in Bristol, 4 years gone, and never an annulment, never a divorce, for I'd not grant her one and the law won't either. She come here calling herself Marsh and Miss, and I don't know what else. But she's mine in the eyes of God and the parish register, both, and I've come for what I'm owed." He glared around the room. "She's no more wed to your fine Duke than I am. You can't marry 2 Miss at once. Even I know that, and I'm only a corn factor." The ballroom erupted. The bishop had gone the colour of his own surplice. He had, 10 minutes before, joined a man in holy matrimony to a woman already married, before 300 witnesses, and the horror of it was crawling over his face. Cordelia's beautiful composure cracked straight down the middle. "He's lying, he's a creditor, he's been paid to lie. Julian. but Julian had taken a step away from her. One step, and it was the loneliest step Adelaide had ever watched a man take, because she could see, even now, even here, that some part of her foolish golden son had truly loved this woman, and was only this instant understanding that the woman had never existed. Cordelia was undone, and she knew it, and a cornered thing strikes. She rounded on Adelaide with her wide hazel eyes gone flat and snake-bright, the tears gone, the crucifix gleaming at her throat over a heaving chest. "You want to talk of crimes. Your Grace, you who's done nothing for 6 months but creep about with that filthy little book, writing your mad lists. Show them your book then. Show them how you sit and scribble, who drinks what and when like a madwoman, counting the angels on a pin. Go on. Show them." It was a mistake. Adelaide had been waiting, in truth, for someone to demand the journal, because a thing you are forced to reveal is believed in a way a thing you offer is not. "By all means," she said, and drew the small leather journal from within her sleeve. "Cordelia would have you believe these are a mad woman's ramblings. Let me read you a sane woman's evidence." She opened it without hurry. "Every night since the spring, a sleeping draught has been carried up to my son's room in a cobalt blue bottle, mixed by Dr. Marsh, and carried up by his niece's own hand. I have recorded the dates. My son has grown paler, all that while short of breath, grey about the mouth. You may all look at him now and judge whether I lie." I remembered the smell of those bottles. I had smelt it once before. She lifted her eyes from the page and looked, for the first time, directly at the grey physician, and her voice did not change at all, and that was the most frightening thing in the room. "I smelt it in my husband's sick room, in the weeks before his heart was said to fail." The silence now was total. Mr. Crane, the bottle, and the apothecary's report. Crane set the cobalt bottle on the table, and beside it a folded paper. "This bottle came off the tray bound for the young Duke's chamber, taken before it could be burned, and its residue analysed by Mr. Penhallow, apothecary of the city, present here today and willing to swear to it." Crane's dry voice went, for one sentence, almost gentle. "The residue is cherry laurel water, bitter almonds under camphor, harmless in a single small dose, lethal in patient accumulating ones, by gradual failure of the heart, masked in a sleeping draught because the dose is hidden by the night." He looked up. "Mr. Penhallow states that in 40 years he has known it used to murder twice, and both times it was put into a sleeping draught. The young Duke has been taking it since the spring." A woman near the front began to scream and was hushed. Julian had gone white as paper. His hand had risen to his own chest, to the grey-tinged lips, and you could see the whole monstrous arithmetic landing on him at once. The draughts, the breathlessness, the year his bride and her uncle had been measuring out for him a careful inch at a time. "They poisoned my father," Adelaide said into that silence, "to clear the way to him, and they meant to poison my son. Within a year of the wedding, the apothecary judges, the dose rising from tonight, so that his weeping widow should inherit Renholt entire, with her uncle to sign the certificate of natural death. The only thing standing between my son and his grave was an old woman who had seen the pattern and written it down, so I had to be made mad and sent away first. That, gentlemen, is what this certificate was for." She closed the journal. "Not to protect me from my delusions, to protect them from my sanity." Dr. Silas Marsh moved toward the doors. He moved very smoothly, the way he did everything, a grey man slipping for the edge of a crowd, and found the plainclothes officer's hand flat on his chest, and Magistrate Hartley's voice, iron now, filling the room. "You will remain, sir. You will all three remain. By the authority I hold, I am detaining the persons of Silas Marsh, of the woman calling herself Cordelia Marsh, and pending inquiry any who aided them, on charges of forgery, conspiracy, and murder. The doors are held. No one leaves Wrenholt tonight but in my custody. Cordelia Marsh, Cordelia Hask, stood in her ivory wedding gown in the centre of the most splendid room she had ever conquered, and watched her uncle's grey calm finally break, and watched her husband Julian look at her as at a stranger, and watched 300 people who had bowed to her an hour ago draw their skirts and their stares away, and her borrowed power went out of her all at once like a snuffed candle, because it had never been hers. It had lived entirely in Julian's belief in her, and Julian no longer believed. That should have been the end. The villains caught, the fraud undone, the poison exposed. But there was one more thing in that room, and it was the hardest, and it belonged to Adelaide alone, Julian. When the officers had taken the Marshes from the ballroom, Cordelia weeping in earnest now, the ugly kind, Marsh silent and already calculating his defence, the great gilded room emptied of its 300 guests in a tide of scandalized whispers, until at last there was only the family. Beatrice, white and trembling by a pillar, who had spent the morning being told her stepmother was dangerous, and the last half-hour learning who the dangerous people actually were. Crane, withdrawn to the wall, and Julian, sitting on the dais step where he had sunk down, in his wedding clothes, his sapphire pin winking, the colour of guilt and terror in his face. He had taken her ring. He had read out the certificate. He had ordered her to Fenwick, and turned her ward against her and stood by, while strangers counted her dead husband's letters into a box. He had been, in every visible way, her enemy. And he had also, Adelaide knew, been the prize they were murdering. The blind, weak, beloved instrument, steered to his own slaughter, who would have been dead within the year, and never known his bride's hand was on the cup. He looked up at her. "I took your ring," he said. His voice had nothing of the Duke in it now. It was a boy's. "I called you mad, before everyone. I let them." He stopped. "Why did you not let me die? You knew. For weeks you knew, and I did nothing for you but cruelty. You could have stayed silent one more night. The draft tonight would have. And then it would all have been yours, free and clear, the trust, the house, no son to stand in your way. Why save me?" It was the question of a man who could not imagine being loved without account, because he had never managed it himself. Adelaide was quiet a moment, and then she did something she had not planned, something that turned the whole night on its hinge. She crossed to where Crane stood and took from his hand the sealed packet, the one in Edmund's. Writing, "To be opened only if my son's birthright is challenged, or if he challenges his mother's," and she held it, unopened, and she looked at it, and then she looked at her son. "Your father left this," she said, "for exactly this hour. Either you challenged my place, which you have done, or someone challenged yours. He thought a day might come when the truth of you would matter very much, and he wanted it ready in a sealed packet, so that it could not be twisted." She turned the packet in her hands. "I know what is in it, Julian. I have known for 26 years. Your father knew before he died. We never spoke of it but once." The boy on the step had gone very still. "You were 3 months old when I married your father," Adelaide said, gently, and the gentleness was the cruelty and the mercy both. "Your mother, your true mother, was a girl your father loved and could not marry, and who died of a fever a week after you were born. He brought you to me, a widower's bastard with no name and no claim, and he asked me to be your mother, and I said yes, and we told the world you were mine, born early, and no one ever questioned a duchess. You are not my son by blood, Julian. You are not your father's lawful heir at all. By the letter of the law, you have no more right to the name of Wrenholt than the footman who gave me his arm the night you took my ring." The room did not breathe. Crane, who had not known, took off his spectacles very slowly, Beatrice's hand had gone to her mouth. "That," Adelaide said, "is what is in this packet. The proof of it in your father's hand, with the dates and the parish where you were christened under another name. If I break this seal in front of the magistrate, you are not the disgraced duke who was deceived by a poisoner. You are a nameless impostor who has held a dukedom he was never entitled to for 11 years. And Beatrice," she nodded toward the trembling girl, "Beatrice is the true and only blood of the 9th Duke, and everything passes to her. And you walk out of this house tonight, with nothing and no one, which is precisely what your bride meant to leave you anyway, only slower." She let him feel the full weight of it. She let the man who had stripped her ring from her finger before 300 people understand that she held in a sealed packet the power to strip from him not merely his estate but his very name, his father, his whole life, and to do it lawfully, justly, with the magistrate 10 feet away. And then, while he waited for the blow, she walked to the great fire that warmed the empty ballroom, and she put the sealed packet into it, unopened, and she watched her husband's last secret blacken and curl and catch. "No," she said quietly, "to the flames. I think not." Julian made a sound. Beatrice made another. "Edmund chose you," Adelaide said, turning back. "A grieving man chose to give a nameless infant his blood's birthright, and he loved you all his life, badly, the way he loved everything but truly. I will not undo your father's choice to punish you for being a fool, when the people who deserve punishing are already in the magistrate's cart. You are the Duke of Renholt. You will go on being the Duke of Renholt." Her grey eyes did not soften. "But understand me. You are the Duke because I have just decided you may be, with the only proof against you, turning to ash behind me. The estate is mine. The trust is real and it stands, and it will pass to you at my death. Only, if you spend the years between now and then becoming a man your father would not have had to hide the truth from, you will earn the name he gave you. You will start by going to your sister and begging her pardon, and then mine, and you will spend a long time on both." She crossed back to him, and she stood over the young man on the step, and she held out her bare right hand, the hand he had taken the ring from. For a moment he did not understand. Then he did. He fumbled in his waistcoat, where he had kept it all these weeks. He had never given it to Cordelia, never sold it, never put it away. He had carried his mother's stolen ring against his own heart the entire time, the way you carry a thing you are ashamed of and cannot let go. And he drew out the Wren signet, and he did not put it on her finger. He knelt. The Duke of Renholt knelt on the floor of his own ballroom in his wedding clothes, and took his mother's bare right hand in both of his, and slid the signet back over the worn, smooth bed it had left in her skin, and bowed his golden head over her knuckles, and wept. The first honest thing Adelaide had seen him do in a year. She let him. She did not grovel, and she did not gush, and she did not pretend the wound was not a wound, but she put her free hand, after a moment, on his bent head, the way she had when he was small and the world frightened him, and she let it rest there. "There," she said softly, "there." Across the room, Nathaniel Crane gathered his documents into his satchel, polishing nothing, watching the Dowager Duchess of Renholt, with her ring back on her hand and her son at her feet, and the whole vast estate answering to her name once. More, and he thought, though he was far too dry a man to say it for some months yet, that he had never in his life so much wanted to deserve a woman's regard. He would say it in time. On an ordinary grey afternoon a season later, in the cold north sitting room, with Tess pretending to mend a curtain, he would take off his spectacles and polish them and put them back, and say plainly that he had ridden through filthy weather once for the principle of the thing, and would happily do it every day of his life, for the woman and Adelaide, who had buried one good man and not expected to be offered another, would put down her journal and consider him a long, dry, level moment, and say that she supposed a solicitor who arrived dead, covered in mud to defend a madwoman, had earned a hearing. And that would be the whole of the proposal. And it would be enough, because neither of them had ever needed a thing dressed up to know it was true. But that was later. That night, the candles burned down in the great gilded ballroom of Wrenholt, the white roses wilting in their stands, the marriage articles abandoned and unsigned on the lawyer's long table. The Marshes rode away in the magistrate's custody, into the black and the rain. Beatrice slept at last, with her hand in her stepmother's, forgiven and forgiving. And the Dowager Duchess of Wrenholt stood at the tall frost-rimed window in her burgundy silk, turning her husband's Wren signet on her finger where it had always belonged, and where, she had decided, and she alone decided such things now, it would stay until she chose the hand that earned it next. They had taken her ring before 300 people to make her small. They had only shown 300 people exactly whose ring it was. A house turns cold when the heart of it stops. Wrenholt had been cold a long time. It was, that night, beginning very slowly, the way the truest things come, to warm.